Good morning. Thanks for joining us for today's webinar. We're going to wait just a few minutes for a few more folks to join us, and then we'll get started in about 2 minutes. Thanks. And so please be sure throughout the webinar, type your questions into the questions box so that we can be sure that we address them. Advance the slides, make sure you're seeing what I'm seeing. Okay, so what is Miami-Dade Counts 2020? We are a collaborative of local and national funders and partners working to ensure that everyone in Miami-Dade gets counted as part of the 2020 census. What started with an initial grant to the Miami Foundation from the Census Equity Fund, which is a national funding collaborative to support census outreach work, has really grown to a much larger local effort. The funders and partners all united in their belief that every individual deserves to be counted, and they had an understanding that complete count efforts take resources and money. We want to take this opportunity to first thank the organizations who are powering this work by providing financial support to the grant making and outreach efforts. Included are Allegheny Franciscan Ministries, the Census Equity Fund, Commissioner Eileen Higgins of District 5, the Children's Trust, Health Foundation of South Florida, Knight Foundation, the Miami Foundation, Stearns Weaver Miller, State Voices, and the Wallace Coulter Foundation. And just as important, a thank you to the organizations that are supporting this work through their partnership and in-kind support. The FIU Metropolitan Center, Radical Partners, United Way of Miami-Dade, and the Early Learning Coalition of Miami-Dade and Monroe counties. At this point, I'm going to hand it over to Natalie to tell you a little bit about the 2020 census and what is at risk for Miami. Natalie, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you now. Natalie, we can't hear you yet, so I think you need to go ahead. Oh, there you go.
I think I'm here. Good morning, everybody. Lindsay, confirm that I am hearable?
We hear you. All good.
Perfect. All right. Good morning, everybody. Again, I'm Natalie Castellanos. I'm the Director of Policy and Public Affairs at the Health Foundation of South Florida, and we are thrilled to be supporting Census 2020, supporting a complete and accurate count here in Miami-Dade County and around South Florida and our state to ensure that we get the maximum resources to our community. And thank you especially to Lindsay and the Miami Foundation for leading the local effort here in Miami-Dade. So I imagine a lot of you on the call are interested in census. You may have already started doing some census work. Perhaps you're involved on the county task force or are engaged in other activities. So I will make this relatively short and sweet about why the census is so important. Census is important because it's about money, knowledge, and power. There's millions of dollars in funding that are at risk if we don't have a complete count in Miami-Dade County and around the state. It was projected that in 2010, we had about a 1% undercount in Miami-Dade. Doesn't sound like a lot, but that translates to about 20,000 or more individuals that were undercounted. And we'll talk about it a little later, and you all probably know there are certain communities that are historically undercounted. And when those folks are undercounted, we get less federal resources for programs like Medicaid, SNAP, food assistance, Head Start, school breakfast, school lunch. And so our communities miss out on critical resources to make sure that our community is healthy, safe, productive. So it's really important that we get a complete count. Data accuracy, knowledge, all sorts of research and all sorts of decisions are made using complete census data. And so when we have an inaccurate census, we have inaccurate data for a decade that informs so many decisions made by businesses, made by researchers, made by people that are making all sorts of decisions and supporting services for our community. And finally, Census, importantly, determines our political power. So it's projected that the state of Florida will gain a seat or possibly two if there's a complete and accurate census. And so that's really important. We want to make sure we have as much representation in Congress, so that's at the congressional level up in DC, but it also determines redistricting, and so that can also be a really important issue. All right, next slide. So why is 2020 census different, and why do we hear so much? Perhaps some of you have heard this effort about different efforts that are coming up to support the census. So a number of things are changing. First of all, census is moving to an online, mostly online count, although people will still be able to respond via paper and via telephone as in the past. Moving to an online census brings with it a whole host of technical issues. There's also more concerns around data security and privacy. And so a lot of efforts need to be made so that folks understand why it's safe and secure to respond online, and especially folks who have less access, right? We know there's a barrier to access to technology in some of our communities. So making sure those folks still are able to get counted in whatever way. This move to technology also means that there's going to be fewer field workers working on census. We know that the Census Bureau is hiring out of communities to get those enumerators, and fewer one-on-one contacts means that it may be more difficult for us to get a complete and accurate census. Second, we know that funding is significantly lower this census than it was in the 2010 census. So this is at all levels, from the federal government, where there have been cuts to the Census Bureau, which means that there's just less outreach to support census, to the state level, where we haven't seen much coming out of the state, although there were 2 bills this past legislative session to try to establish a complete count committee at the state level. We haven't seen much action from the state, and certainly no appropriations yet, although it's never too late. And finally, we know that there is a larger climate of mistrust and fear in a lot of our communities that tend to be undercounted anyway. So immigrants, especially communities of color, and other folks are feeling LGBTQI communities potentially. So there's more of a climate of fear, and it is crucial for all of our communities to be counted. So these are some of the issues that we are going to be facing, and I'm sure a lot of you are already encountering this in your own work. Next slide, please. So I mentioned this on an earlier slide. So these historically undercounted populations. So we know from over 100 years of census work that there are some populations that tend to be undercounted in census, and they include racial and ethnic minorities, people who do not speak English fluently, lower income households, individuals experiencing homelessness, immigrants who may not have authorized paperwork, young and mobile persons, so that's the millennials or probably Gen Z at this point, college students, children under the age of 5 have been a historically undercounted group, persons who are angry at or just distrust the government, and then LGBTQ individuals. And next slide. What do we know about Miami-Dade County? For those of you who live here, work here, a lot of those nationally undercounted group are highly represented here in Miami-Dade County. This is a map from a really interesting hard to count tool. I really recommend those of you who have not been on this map, there's a link at the bottom of this screen. It's Census Hard to Count Maps 2020.us. And it's an interactive tool where you can actually get down to the census tract level and see what are predicted response rates, and then what are some of the demographic characteristics within these census tracts. And so the darker red census tracts are places where the response rate might be as low as 50%. And so if you know the geography of our community, you can imagine these are places where there's high concentration of immigrants, high concentration of Black Americans or other populations that might not be counted more often in the census. So with that, I will turn it over to Lindsay to talk about the opportunities in the collaborative.
Thank you, Natalie, much appreciated. So while the focus of today's webinar is on the grant making program, the Miami-Dade Counts Collaborative is really approaching this work in a much broader way. There's 3 components to this work: grant making, outreach, and partnership. The grant making component is essential. So there's no allocation from the federal government, state government, or local county government in terms of allocating financial resources for the on-the-ground community organizations to support complete count efforts. And we understand that we need to put the dollars in the hands of organizations who are really well positioned in hard to count communities. We want the trusted local organizations to be the ones to carry the message to their constituents that census participation is essential for all the reasons that Natalie just mentioned. We also plan to help support outreach efforts. We're working with the FIU Metropolitan Center to conduct focus groups and help us understand what types of census messaging really resonates with the various hard to count groups in Miami. We will then use that information gathered to create resources and toolkits to help Miami-Dade organizations message to their constituents on the importance of census participation. These resources will eventually live on the website that the collaborative just launched, www.miamicensus.org. And finally, the collaborative wants to act as a partner in the community and generally work to unite philanthropists, influencers, nonprofits, and residents around all efforts related to Census 2020. But now, more about the grant program. So the collaborative has pulled together its financial resources and now has more than $475,000 available to grant out to organizations in Miami-Dade in support of complete count efforts. Grants will be awarded to nonprofit and governmental organizations that are well positioned to encourage traditionally hard to count communities to participate in Census 2020. We're willing to fund a number of approaches to this work, and this is including, but not limited to, convening community complete count groups, providing organizational capacity to do census work, supporting collaborations between local community groups to engage in outreach, funds to support community sites that would provide information and assistance in participating in the census, funds to organize events to promote participation, funds to support targeted communications efforts to hard to reach communities, and funds to secure support from elected officials and municipalities. These are just some of the ways we imagine we will use our grant dollars, but again, we're open to other approaches that we look forward to reading when the applications come in. In terms of timelines, the RFP was released last week on July 9th, and proposals are due by the end of day on August 15th with no exceptions. Grants will be awarded this fall with notification in October. And I'm going to dig into a little bit more detail about the grant program. So the average grant size we're anticipating will be between $5,000 and $25,000. And as I mentioned, we have over $475,000 available for grant making. And note, we are still fundraising. We know that there is a huge amount of need out there. So we are still writing grant applications and knocking on funder doors locally and nationally to try and boost that number, because we want to make sure we can support all of the complete count efforts that are happening in Miami-Dade County. So who's eligible to apply? 501c3 nonprofit organizations, as well as governmental entities servicing Miami-Dade County, are eligible to apply. Additionally, groups that have an established fiscal sponsor that is a 501c3 nonprofit are also eligible to submit an application. Each organization may submit one application, and applications will be accepted through the Miami Foundation's submittable grant portal. The link is here. It also can be found within the grant program guidelines and on the miamicensus.org website. The full list of questions that we're going to be asking in the grant application are included in the program guidelines, which can be found at miamicensus.org. And the attachments that will be required include a proposal budget, an organization operating budget, as well as a current board list. So please, we haven't seen too many questions come into the chat yet, but please go ahead, add your questions, and then we will go ahead. I'm going to first go through some of the frequently asked questions that we kind of anticipated coming into today. And I'm going to try to get as many answered as possible. So, can our organization apply? So yes, If you are a 501c3 organization or government entity, if not, you need a fiscal sponsor. This is not open to individuals to apply. How much can you request? Grant awards, as I said, will be in the range of $5,000 to $25,000. Where do I find census tract information? So if you've had a chance already to look at the program guidelines, we're really clear that we want to use grant funds to ensure that complete count efforts are happening in the hard to count communities. That means we need to know in your grant application which hard to count community you are planning to work in, or which communities you're planning to work in. We will be asking specifically for census tract data. So you can find that information at census.gov or at the maps that Natalie referred to earlier, Census Hard to Count Maps 2020.us. And so you can find out which census tracts your organization is serving and whether they're actually considered hard to count. What is the grant term? The term will be October 1st through May 31st of 2020. Who is the grant coming from? So the Miami Foundation will be awarding grants on behalf of the collaborative of funders. But in terms of who's deciding the grant awards, it will be up to the committee of funders and partners who have expertise on the community needs. So you saw earlier in the slides the list of the funders and supporters, and there will be representatives from many of those organizations who will be helping us to read the applications, rate the applications, and come to a group decision on which organizations we think are really best situated to make an impact as it relates to ensuring Miami-Dade gets a complete count in 2020. So we want you to get involved, and there's a few ways you can get involved. You can apply for funds through our grant program. You can help us spread the word. Tell your family, tell your friends, tell your colleagues that the census is happening April 2020. But the work is happening now. The conversations are happening now. I'm sure everybody is seeing it in the news as much as we are. And we want to keep the conversation going. We need everybody to understand the importance of the census and understand why the information gathered is so important to Miami-Dade's future. And we want to be a resource to you. We have the contact information for both Natalie and I up here on the screen. We're going to try to play the role of connector. So if you reach out to us and tell us you're doing something, whether you get a grant or not, we still want to work with you. We want to figure out how we can help support your efforts and connect you with partners who can amplify your efforts. If you have a resource you're creating, we want to be able to consider it for listing it on miamicensus.org. We want to help all census efforts happening in our community. So please get involved, apply for a grant, and keep us in the loop as you're doing work in this space. We're trying to stay on top of kind of national efforts, national best practices, and we're going to do our best to kind of bring some of the national conversation and help bring the best national resources down to the local level. So at this point, I'm going to go ahead, open it up for questions. Again, please write your questions into the question box on your screen. So far, I only see one question in there. The first question that we have is there messaging available to help mitigate the fears people may have, myths versus realities? Yes, there is actually messaging out there. I wouldn't say yet that there's local messaging, and that's one of the, when I kind of was covering outreach, and then one of the pieces we're doing as we're conducting focus groups to understand what are the messages that resonate. And that's what we're trying to understand, what kind of language we should be using when we're talking about the census to our communities, and hopefully putting together toolkits and flyers and information that you guys can, that organizations can then use in their communities to dispel some of those myths and make it really clear what the reality is. So currently the local toolkit does not exist, it's in progress, but there are national resources out there. And if you go to the resources page of miamicensus.org website, there's a link to a one-pager with what we think are some of the best national resources. And through the resources there, you're actually going to find national partners that do have some amazing messaging tools available that you can use with your constituents to hopefully help dispel some of the myths around the census. Other questions? We'll leave it open for just a few minutes. Okay, I see a few more coming in. Okay, If we are a very large government agency that serves the entire county, could we be considered for a grant above the $25,000 max threshold? That would be established on a case-by-case basis. Again, considering that we have limited funds available, we set the max grant at $25,000. If you do want to be considered for something above that, we would need to have an offline conversation. But again, it is unlikely that any grant awarded would be above the $25,000 threshold. Next question. Is this funding specifically for census work in Miami-Dade, or can it support work in other counties? So this work is specifically for Miami-Dade County. I know that there are other groups up in Broward and Palm Beach and Monroe that are trying to start pulling together census efforts and raising money for similar work, but this pool of funds is very specifically for Miami-Dade County. We got the question, what does a successful proposal look like? What kind of community collaboration are you looking for? What is the impact and outcomes you're looking for from grantees? Wow, that's a lot. Okay. A successful proposal is, we want to see that you are the best situated organization to be reaching out to the hard-to-count communities, and that you have a plan for how to reach them. So we want to see that you have proven expertise, that you are the trusted messenger, that if you send them an email, you send them a text message, you knock on their door, you talk to them about the census, they're going to trust information coming from you, because you as the trusted longtime partner are the ones that they've been working with over years and decades. And so if you tell them it is safe to participate and here's how you do it and let me help you with my smartphone, they're going to trust you to do that. So we need you to be able for your application to show that you're the trusted partner, that you're best situated, either in or around a hard to count community, that you've experienced serving them, you understand what it means to be a hard to count community, and that you understand what types, you've done the research looking at kind of national efforts like around census messaging to say what works and what doesn't work, that you have a well thought out budget for how you plan to use any funds that you're asking for. In terms of community collaboration, we want to see, we're not requiring that you partner specifically with another organization or organizations as part of the grant, but we also understand that collaboration and partnership is key to any real successful effort. And so if you show that you have partners at the table working with you to accomplish whatever it is you're proposing in your grant proposal, that will probably go a long way, especially if you have a history of partnering with those organizations, because that means hopefully through those partnerships, your reach is going to be even further. And in terms of the impact and outcomes we're looking for from grantees, we have a number of them, but generally, we are going to be looking at, it's going to be hard to measure until after the census and we actually see the numbers of participation, especially as it's compared to the 2010 numbers. But we're going to be generally looking for how many touch point efforts, how many doors did you knock on, how many emails did you send, what kind of reach did you have with your population, and just narrative stories about that, some data to show what it is you were able to accomplish with the dollars. And some of it is going to be case by case depending on what you received a grant to do. If you were receiving a grant more on the policy side in terms of talking to local city government or commissioners, tell us about how many you talked to, how many conversations did you have, what movement did we see forward as a result of those conversations. The next question. Can you share what you know about the technology the census will use this year? How can outreach workers assist, and are there restrictions on what outreach workers can do to assist with online filling out the forms? So honestly, that's going to be a better question. I know there's a ton of resources on the census.gov website. I know there's new technology that they're putting in the hands of the census outreach workers that are going to be after kind of the self-response period that will be going door to door, new tablets and systems that they're putting in their hands that were not available in 2010. But I can't say I know specifically how exactly outreach workers can assist in terms of actually filling out the forms. What I do know is that community organizations that through this online response, that if community organizations have an iPhone, have a tablet, that they can help an individual household participate using that shared tablet. It doesn't have to be from the individual household's phone or computer. That if you're hosting, whether it be at a library or community center, a bunch of computers so that community members can come in and participate, you can help them participate in that way. And sorry, I don't have a more detailed answer, but the census.gov website actually has an incredible amount of information on that topic and goes really deep into the technology that they're using this year and how it differs from 2010. So I referenced the impact on Florida with the 2010 count. How much was Miami-Dade undercounted in 2010, and how much revenue does the Miami-Dade undercount represent? Does Miami-Dade expect to pick up a congressional seat with the improved count, or are the stated 1 to 2 seats in other counties? So I know it is predicted that in 2020 that the state of Florida could potentially get 1 to 2 new seats in the House of Representatives, specifically for Miami-Dade. I'm not sure, but there is an estimated, for every person undercounted, I believe as part of the 2010 census, they're using the number that it was worth somewhere between $1,800 and $2,400 per person per year that was lost to the state, and to the county, or to the state, and then it trickles down to the county and its services. In terms of the revenue, Natalie, do you want to jump in and answer any of the other aspects of that question?
Yeah, that's actually a really good question on the apportionment. I'm actually not clear, and right, a lot of the data that's provided is given to us at the state level, and we just have to make some assumptions with Miami-Dade being so populous and having so many undercounted groups. But yeah, so the 1% undercount in 2010, remember the difference with 2010 is it was a well-funded census, it was a different climate, although still some issues at that time. So it was about 24,000 individuals in Miami-Dade County, give or take, certainly, were undercounted. And yeah, when you multiply that out, it's tens of millions of dollars that the county probably would have received in some level, or individuals and communities would have received through these federally funded programs. And then over the course of the decade, it translates into about hundreds of millions of dollars. And remember, a lot of the undercounted groups are the ones that rely more on some of the federal assistance programs, like the school lunches and school breakfast and Medicaid and SNAP. So I think some of those numbers might not even be proportional to what's on the table. So hopefully that's a little helpful.
Thank you, Natalie. So the next question is, which areas are specifically directed? Was Brownsville on the list? I looked at the map and it wasn't clear. So I don't want to get into today naming which specific tracks were or were not included as hard to count, because there is a lot of them in Miami-Dade. Miami-Dade, in terms of in the state of Florida, was the hardest to count county with very high numbers of undercount from 2010. And so I really recommend go to that hard to count map, go to census.gov, and you can actually zoom into just Miami-Dade County. You can look at your zip code and see which census tract, which census tracts kind of overlap with which cities and communities to figure out what was or wasn't hard to count. If you still have questions after you've kind of dug into those maps and the information available, definitely shoot us an email and someone will jump on the call and help you really try to figure out whether the community that your organization is working in is considered a hard to count community. Next question. Would relatively new organizations with no staff yet strong board members and strong community ties be eligible to apply? Yes, we're not saying that you have to be in existence for any set amount of time, but it will be a much tougher case to make if you haven't been in the community as long, because from what we understand, we want the organizations who are really have the long-term experience of serving a specific group within the community to be the trusted messengers of census information. But that being said, if you've been kind of an informal organization but only recently incorporated, and you can prove through your application that you have experience and connections and that you're well situated to help ensure that some subset of our community gets counted, we're happy to consider your organization program. If the grant is geared towards a community event for education and convening, what does a successful event look like? Again, we leave it to you to tell us why your event would be impactful, why it would be more than just, a one-day thing, how you plan to do follow-up, how through that one day you were able to share the message about census importance by X amount with this many people, and eventually hopefully show that you were able to increase participation in your community. So we're going to leave it to you to tell us what a successful event looks like. We're not going to tell you that because we do want to leave it open. We don't know all the answers for the best ways to reach these hard to count communities. So we're hoping through grant applications, we learn about new approaches and the innovative ways your organizations want to approach this work. What is the timeline for work and mix of education and actual participation assistance that you all see as best practices desirable? Again, similar to my last answer, we're not dictating a timeline. We're going to be awarding the grants in October. Census Day is officially April 1st. Census messaging is going to be starting, like the actual mailing of forms is going to be starting in March, but the bigger kind of communications push from the federal government is going to be starting as early as January. And so that is when a lot is happening. But then again, census conversations and events are already happening. So we don't have a timeline, but when we think about actual participation assistance, that obviously has to take place during the window between when the online form opens and the postcards get mailed out to homes. And so you will have to go to the Census website, really look at the detailed calendar, and if you're saying that you're going to be doing participation assistance, make sure that you're understanding when that needs to be and that you're staffed up and volunteered up in an appropriate way during that timeline to make an impact. Will this PowerPoint be available online? Yeah, this webinar is being recorded. We're going to make it available on MiamiCensus.org website, as well as the Miami Foundation website. So you can share, you can see, you can listen to the webinar again, and we can also make these slides available as well. Can individual members of a coalition apply for funding aligned with the coalition's strategies? Only 501c3 nonprofit organizations can apply, or government entities, or those with a fiscal sponsor. So if you are part of a coalition, you need to apply, and the coalition is a 501c3, you need to apply using the organization's 501c3. If you're a coalition without a 501c3, you need to find a fiscal sponsor or an organization that you work with that's part of the coalition that is a 501c3 that is willing to sponsor the grant application. Are 501c3 or 501c4s eligible? No. For this specific funding, it's only eligible to 501c3 organizations. Okay. Would a voters registration campaign be considered a qualifier for this grant? This is not about voter registration. This is about census outreach and participation. So we know that 2020 is going to be filled with a lot of voter registration work, which is incredibly important and we're very much in support of, but this specific grant program is not focused on voter registration. It is focused on census participation. How innovative and technologically integrated could our proposals be? Yeah, we're open to anything. Again, like we don't assume that we know all of the best approaches. So if you have a unique way of approaching this work that involves technology or is incredibly innovative, we want to hear about it. Obviously, you need to be able to explain through your grant application how you are best situated to kind of do that work and that innovation can be realized. But no, we're open. I got another question about, was Brownsville one of the targeted areas? Again, you're going to need to look at the hard to count maps and the information on census.gov to specifically understand which are the hard to count communities in Miami-Dade that we are hoping to target and support with grant funding. Trump ordered Homeland Security to work with Census 2020 and turn over documents. How can we get access to such documents? Immigrant trends by county, visa visitors by country, by county. So there's a question about this. So there's a much longer history to the census and how it is governed, but the specific information gathered in the census is protected and will not be shared. The individual level data by law cannot be shared for, I forget the number of years, but it is multiple decades of years before individual level data becomes open to the public. And so I can't specifically answer your question, but as it relates to talking about the security of the information, as you're talking to your communities, their individual data collected through the census is protected and will not be turned over to any other government agency or group.
Lindsay, I can elaborate on that quickly too.
Great.
So yeah, correct. The important thing is, yes, individually identifiable census information is protected. It is confidential for 72 years. If there's any breach to that confidentiality, that is, there's criminal and civil penalties connected to it. So it's very, very tight data protection around individual census responses. I think the question is a really good one about how the president responded with an executive order around making every single federal agency supply information to the Commerce Department. And so, one, it's unclear whether or not that's legal, constitutional. Assuming it is, it's going to be done in a non-identifiable way. Still concerning, it's valid to have those concerns, but for individual census responses, it actually shouldn't impact. And so I think one of the things too with these grants and with you all who have the expertise of the communities, coming up with ways to individually counsel people who have these concerns, I think it is going to come up. So we're happy to brainstorm and think about with you all the right way to approach that messaging and that kind of counseling that's going to be required for some of the folks that have those specific questions and fears around giving their sensitive information to the government.
Perfect, very helpful. Thank you, Natalie. So a few more questions. So for whichever population we choose to work with, we need to show data that this is a hard to count community. Yes, exactly. This effort, this collaborative, we are interested in funding complete count efforts and specifically ensuring those in the hard to count communities get counted. And so there is a question in the application that asks which census tracts you are working in, showing that it's hard to count, and through your narrative, just explaining what you've learned about why they're hard to count and how you are connected to this community and the best situated to serve this community and help them get. If partnering, would each partner apply for their own grant or a joint application? We would recommend in this case a joint application with the kind of maybe the strongest or most well-known partner being the one applying on behalf of the partnership. It would not benefit you to have multiple groups applying for the exact same thing. We've already addressed the question about new organizations with no staff, that yes, you can apply, but you'll need to kind of show that without staff, how you're going to have the capacity to actually, execute on the work. Okay. Is an organization only allowed to apply for one grant? Our organization works with multiple initiatives, and we could potentially leverage several of these outreach in different areas of the county, specifically with different models and partners. With this all needs to be within one budget and one application. At this point, we're considering only one grant per organization. If you really feel like you need to make the case for why you would need to submit multiple grants, we're open to, you can send me an email offline and we're happy to consider it. But again, we are really trying to limit this to one application per organization. I recommend that you work with multiple initiatives, maybe have one of your partners in another part of the community consider applying for that. And how do we match tracts to zip codes? That information can be found both on census.gov as well as on the hard to count maps, both visually and I believe through Excel exports that they have through both systems, you can actually see how the census tracts line up with zip codes. Because again, I do know that it is confusing because census tract is not the same as a zip code. Okay, I think I got to the end of the questions. Natalie, do you see anyone here, any of the chat box that I missed?
I do not.
Okay. Well, again, we so appreciate this turnout today for the webinar. We appreciate your interest in being part of the larger effort that is taking place in Miami-Dade County to support complete count work related to Census 2020. We look forward to partnering with you, whether it's through a grant or otherwise. And we appreciate you and the hard work you're doing in our community. Thank you, Natalie, for participating on the webinar with me. And thank you to our funders and partners and supporters for allowing us to do this work and entrusting us with this important effort. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and close the webinar. And again, please visit our website, download the grant guidelines, apply for a grant, and reach out if you have any follow-up questions. Thanks and have a great day.